redeemed himself from evil. Christ then is able to redeem the one who is caught up in evil. We can then trust in him as Redeemer because our redemption is assured. We can place our trust in him. Page 3, because of this work of Christ, then we have a God who has already defeated evil and has great power over evil. It is not a case of God's power being relativized with evil, but rather God's power over evil is already assured. This incarnational answer is based on trust in the God who acts. We have the record of the God who has acted through history, and I believe that he continues to act today and that his being can only be understood in terms of his acts. God's power over evil is demonstrated by occasions when Jesus was confronted by Satan and satanic spirits. The results were always the same. Satan himself could not prevail when he tempted Jesus shortly after his baptism. Whenever Jesus met a demon-possessed man, the spirit always cried out, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy." It is significant that the evil spirit knew who Jesus was and began an immediate retreat. There is no question of who had the power. The description of events in Gethsemane led me to believe that Jesus was preparing himself for the great battle with evil. The cross would not only become the symbol of his own redemption from evil, but our redemption as well. The power of evil over the grave was broken. The last Adam has arisen. As it says in the scripture, "O death, where is thy sting?" Using this incarnational approach to the problem of evil, let us now consider several major issues which remain unresolved. And frankly, I'm unable to resolve all of the issues. There are things that we cannot know. But the thing that keeps coming back to me is my realization of the fact, and this is going to sound strange, that there is another reality in our lives, in the world, that's just as real as the reality that we know, but we can't touch that reality unless we are dying. And I come to that conclusion through a near-death experience that I had. And as I was falling to what I thought was my death, I saw hundreds and hundreds of pictures of my life. I saw my wife at home, my brother and his at home, my mother. I saw every room of our house, every room of my mother's house, every room of my brother's house. I even saw the house that we moved out of in Illinois when I was 8 years old. I saw every room of that house. And I survived, of course. But after this was over, about 3 months after it was over, I realized that in those pictures of the house in Illinois, that in the dining room I had seen as I was falling, I saw a china cabinet built into the corner of the room. And I couldn't, for the life of me, remember that, other than I saw it in the picture, but I couldn't remember it as a kid. So 20 years later, we're in Illinois. We spent half a day finding the house. It wasn't easy because everything had changed. Found the house, knocked on the door. Would you believe the lady was home and she even let us in? Walked into the dining room and there was that cabinet that I had seen. Now, there's no rational explanation for such a thing. There just is there's no way we can explain that, except I believe that there is another reality that is parallel to ours. And I think that's when we'll know the answers, but be able to answer all of the questions that we have. So let's go to towards the bottom of page 3. The first is a significant question of the origin of evil. How did evil get into the world? Did God create evil? If he did create evil, is he less good than a God who did not create evil? Process theology tells us that God did not create the world out of nothing. But we read it, in the Hebrew, in Genesis it says, and God created out of nothing. Is the Hebrew word bara, it's out of nothing, out of a void, literally, out of a void. But here, process theology says, rather out of chaos. So if a little disorder and evil remains, it's understandable, since God really had his hands full and did the best that he could do under rather trying circumstances. This answer explains how evil got there, matches life experiences, and still allows for a kind God. But I would argue that God created out of nothing a perfect world with no evil. Evil entered the world through the actions of humankind, not God. Somehow bound up with the freedom that Adam and Eve were given, they made a choice that allowed sin into the world. I don't know what their forbidden fruit was, but it's evident that the order of humanity after the fall was different than the order of humanity before the fall. It could be argued that an all-powerful God could have stopped evil from entering the world. I agree that he had the power to do so, but rather he allowed evil to enter because by definition there had to be sin before there could be redemption. Man had fallen. Only God could redeem humankind and human order. Only God could restore humankind to its perfect form. There had to be sin before there could be forgiveness. There had to be a verdict before there could be grace. There had to be condemnation before there could be mercy. The important thing is that God allows for a way out, a way to escape from evil and sin. This way out becomes a supreme demonstration of his love for us, which to us is so meaningful because of the presence of evil in the world. The redemption is not only redeems us, but also restores humanity to the perfect order it was before the fall. The second Adam, Jesus Christ, cancels out the effects of the first Adam. In this rather technical debate, we must be sure to keep the emphasis in the right place. God did not design life as the stage upon which he set evil so that we could act out like robots in a mindless fashion his will, leading us eventually to redemption and oneness with him. Rather, God gave humans the free choice. It was humankind who chose the evil, not because man is innately evil, but because man was given the freedom to choose and did choose the evil. And that is all that we can say. Another unresolved issue is the problem of suffering and death. How can God allow a 4-year-old child of Christian parents, or any parents, to die of leukemia? How could God allow a 65-year-old lady to die of cancer when her husband is a stroke victim and they both were missionaries in China? And that happened right here in Redlands. I suppose someone told the parents of the recently deceased 4-year-old that good would come out of it for them or others. Their response might well be, we're not worth the life of our 4-year-old child. How can we see good in what appears to us to be abject tragedy? When as a 14-year-old boy I saw my father die right in front of me, it shattered my life, and I never, ever expected that good would come out of it. And in fact, I'm standing before you today talking about this subject because I spent my whole life chasing the question of God, and when I was 14, I wasn't a Christian, so I said, God, if there is a God, how could you let my father, who was a good man, die? And in searching that question, I found faith in Christ, became a Christian, and eventually ended up in the ministry because of that tragedy in my life. But I'm still chasing the question, how could you let a good man die? About a week after my dad died, I remember seeing a man in the alley who was homeless, and he came by about once a week going through the trash. And I was so shocked because here was this guy, still looking through the trash, and my father was dead. Why would my father die when he was a good man, and maybe the other man was not as good? So perhaps we ought to stop trying. We can only affirm that God is good and remain in silence. I believe that it is at this point that God breaks through and takes the hand of the suffering person. Suddenly, it is okay, and the questions of how and why don't matter anymore. The only thing that does matter is that God is present. He is here now and holding the hand of the suffering one. Now, the suffering one has a direct line to God. For God in Jesus Christ is a suffering God. He suffered for us and in our place. The Holy One left the courts of heaven to endure the unspeakable, so that we, even in our agony, would have a way out. My grace is sufficient for thee, not because of divine decree, but because of divine suffering on the part of God incarnate, Jesus Christ. Now, the final issue I want to approach is the problem of accidents. The first church I ever had, I reported to work at church on Monday, and 2 days later on Wednesday, a leading member of the church, the chairman of the deacons, was killed in a head-on collision right on the highway. And that was my first official job, was to conduct that funeral. How can that be? We read all the time about people killed in earthquakes, fires, dams, bursting automobiles, typhoons, and lightning. The list could go on and on. How can God allow this to happen? What do I, as a new minister, say to this widow whose husband was just killed? How do I approach that? So the answers generally fall into three categories. One, there is no God. Two, God wound up the world and departed for parts unknown quite some time ago. Or three, there is a God, but he is powerless to intervene in the natural order. And that is, of course, what process theology says. And number three, I reject number one out of hand because of the testimony of both natural and special creation. It says in Romans that the creation itself calls out and witness to God. Category two is equally unappealing, without foundation in my life experience. This leaves us with the last option, which is the route of process theology. The God of process theology is a God who cannot stop the speeding bullet. He is a God who is kind and loving, but not much help in a crisis. Now, that really isn't too bad if everything goes along well in life. But what do we do when there is a crisis? How is that God able to break through the problem of evil and sin? Where is the empty tomb? How can I live with hope? With such a construct, God, who would never have been able to break into the human timeline of history, reverse the natural order, and raise Jesus from the dead. The central doctrine of Christianity would be lost, and we would have no hope. And as an alternative to the above three suggestions, I would like to suggest that we have no explanation for these accidents and natural disasters. They do happen. But when they do happen, we have God's presence there too. He is Emmanuel, God with us, who has promised never to leave us nor forsake us. We who know him must simply throw up our hands in a simple trust at this point and realize that we live in a broken world, and thus we become broken as well. 7 times I've been diagnosed with cancer. The first time was a terrible shock because I was active as a hospice chaplain, and every day I was visiting people with cancer. I wasn't having cancer. I was the one who visited the people with cancer. And suddenly, I had cancer, and I said, I wasn't very profound in my response. You know what I said to the doctor? I said, "Doctor, you must be mistaken." And he assured me that he wasn't mistaken. And it took me a couple of weeks to figure it out, of why I had cancer. And here's the answer I came to. The answer why I had cancer was because I live in a broken world a world of diseases and accidents. And if you live in a broken world, sometimes you get broken. And that's how I came to this. Never forget that we live in a creaturely existence. And this is right from Professor Ray Anderson at Fuller, which means that we are subject to all the physical laws of the earth as well as participants in the earth's tendency towards entropy. The world has this almost, I would call it a rush towards entropy. Entropy means seeking a random order. The world seeks a random order. Why do we have kings and queens in really old countries like England? Because in this disorder, the human psyche, the human soul, craves order out of the disorder. And having a king, someone the head of the state, someone to give orders, someone who reigns supreme, is one way to try to bring peace and order into this world which is rushing toward entropy. We must always keep in mind that the central truth that arcs over all humankind since the time of Adam and Eve is that the God who acts in history continues to be present with his people today. Then follow all of the citations, the footnotes, pages of footnotes that you can read on your own. So I'm the first one to tell you that I have not come up with all of the answers. I've come up with some answers. There's some things that won't be answered on this side of heaven. And while it's true that, and I do believe with all my heart that God redeems tragedy. Redemption is not just about the human soul, it's about the whole human and his experience. God redeems tragedy. Redeem means to buy back again. I'm old enough to remember when we got S&H green stamps when we bought things. Remember that, Doctor? We pasted them in a book, and then there was a catalog, and there was a redemption store, and you could buy this nice picture for only 6 books, and you could bring your books down there, and they'd give you the picture. That's being redeemed. God redeems tragedy. Now, while I know that is a fundamental and ultimate truth, that is not helpful to someone who is in the throes of tragedy. If your husband dies, that is of little solace. If you're a kid and your dad dies or your mom, that's no answer. Because it may take a whole lifetime for you to see that redemption. And even then, you might not even see it on this side of heaven. But I do believe that God redeems tragedy. He did in my life. Now, questions that you'd like to ask. It's a pretty heavy topic today.
You're still stuck with the Holocaust, I'm sorry.
Yes, still stuck with the Holocaust. That's the big one. How do you explain the Holocaust? And let me give you this example. Tragedy can drive you towards God or away from God. And that's the way the Holocaust is. The interesting thing is that the tragedy in my life drove me towards God. We were not a Christian home. We never went to church. My brother, 2 years older than me, he was 16, it drove him away from God for his whole life. And it's true with the Holocaust, this horrible, unthinkable happening, showing the evil that's in the world, causes some people to be forced away from God, and other people it has forced into faith in God. And I have no answer I wouldn't attempt to answer how there could be so much evil in the world, and not just the Holocaust, it's ongoing tragedies today. The things going on in Palestine. and the killing of people. I mean, just unbelievable things. But evil is in the world. We can't deny it. And we don't know why the God who acts doesn't just zap all of the bad people. But having said that, I am so happy that I'm not in charge of the zapping. Because being human, I probably zap a few innocent people too. Other comments, questions, observations?
You're very brave taking on the subject of theodicy, of the problem of evil.
Yeah, theologians have had nervous breakdowns over that. I mean, but I just have to say that I have come to the point of knowing that there are some questions that we can't answer now. We just cannot answer, the Holocaust being one of them. We just can't answer why that happened. How could God allow that to happen? Where was God in the Holocaust? That's the question people have asked for years. Where was God in the Holocaust? But I certainly like the approach of incarnational theology better than the approach of process theology. Because in process theology, I just have God as a nice grandfather who wishes he could help, but unfortunately he can't.
You've dismissed the devil.
I didn't deal with the devil. It's a devil of a question. And how did evil enter the world? And what is going to be in the end times? So you can read Revelation to understand that. So I read Revelation. I didn't understand it. So I sat down when I was in college. I needed a project. So I had taken 2 years of Greek. So I sat down and translated Book of Revelation from the Greek. And I was just totally confused after I did that. So I don't know. The problem of evil. There's so many questions we can't answer. I mean, I've only spent 50 years studying, this thing, and I can't answer it. But if you have an answer, I'm glad to hear it. Yes. Wait, we can't hear you. Try this one.
Swap. Thanks. Sorry, Nilda.
And I hate to speak up because you studied it for years and years and years, but I always wonder if God created the heavens and the earth, what was he going to do with thousands and millions of people? And you have to do something. So I'm trying to be practical about this, okay? And we find life is not fair. And so I don't know if you call this fatalism or what, but you're dealt what you're dealt. And I think personally we can do the best that we learn and cope with and every day, but you got to have a solution with the population somehow. And it leads me in my life to be so thankful of every moment and every friend and every learning situation that I'm allowed to have in my life. And it leads me to be, I think, a more grateful person when I don't understand how the allotment is given to all of us. I don't know that it's going to make a tragedy easier for me, but I think I try to understand it in that way.
My wife and I have traveled to every continent except Antarctica, and the one thing I've taken away from that is how blessed we are. Because in much of the world we're rich because we have what we have when they have nothing. So yes, and life isn't fair. And I taught sixth grade once, and that one concept that the sixth graders could not accept was the concept that life isn't fair. and they get real upset. But that's not fair. Well, yeah, I know that's the way it is, though. Some people are born to rich families and some are born to poverty. It's not fair. It's a struggle. I have no answer to that either. And if you want to read about end times, again, the book of Revelation, but it is so allegorical that I have a hard time really coming to any conclusions about anything. It's a struggle. So I don't know. Eschatology remains a great mystery to me. But I do know the only thing I do know is that God is real. He's been real in my life, and He's blessed me immensely. And not that I deserved it. It's His grace. That's just the God that we have. And we're just so fortunate, to live in Redlands, California, and last night we had heat. It was kind of cold, and we just turned the thermostat up a little. These are all things we take for granted. And yet in much of the world, and we were in Zambia, and the women were sweeping out their huts, and they just had dirt floors, and they were sweeping the dirt to get it clean. So I don't have the answers to those things, so sadly, I'll have to send you away without the answers you were looking for. This is what I figured out in 50 years. But I know that God is real. Yes?
You mentioned you believe that tragedy was redeemed along with people, and you said you had an example of that from your own life. Would you mind sharing it?
Yes, your question was that tragedy is redeemed, and I had an example from my own life?
That's what I believe you said.
Yeah. Yes. You see, the death of my father was a defining issue in my life. It upended my life. I was 14. You couldn't lose a parent at a more crucial age, and I was totally lost. And in trying to figure out that loss, that's why I spent all of this time trying to figure it out. And now I can look back and say, oh yes, this tragedy was redeemed. God redeemed it. Out of this tragedy, God brought good. I spent my whole life helping people spiritually. And it was generated by the loss of my father. Because I underwent that loss when I had no hope. And then when I found Christ, I had hope. And I know what the difference is between living a life with no hope and living a life with a Christian hope of Jesus Christ. There's a huge difference. And that's what drove me on. So, yes, God redeemed my tragedy, and I believe that He will redeem the tragedy for the parents of the 4-year-old who died, and I don't know how or when or if they'll even see it in their life. But somehow I do believe that God's redemption not only is for the human soul, but it's for all tragedy in the world. And so if you extend that, then my thinking is that God will eventually redeem evil in the end times. And that'll be the end of evil. He'll buy it back again. But this isn't a class on the end times. If we had a class on that, we'd be really out at sea. Because that's really wild. If you start studying the doctrine of the last things, it's called eschatology. Well, thank you very much for coming. You're very brave to sit here and listen to this, and I'm glad to share it with you. It was my pleasure. Thank you.